Human groups are made of human systems. This show stands at the practical intersection of counterintelligence, trauma psychology, and systems thinking. My research focuses on how people, groups, and institutions lose the ability to see reality clearly, and what happens when decisions keep getting made anyway. I'm Kip Perez, and this has changed the game. A lot of people think better thinking fixes broken systems. If you improve your decision making, you tighten your feedback loops, expand your inputs, all of these nice little buzzwords, and then your system will magically improve. That's the default assumption in a lot of leadership work. But that only holds if the environment is neutral and all the actors are working in good faith. But what if that's not the case? What if the issue isn't bad information, but the fact that what people are seeing and questioning and acting on is being shaped from inside the system itself with a bad actor? At that point, you're dealing with orientation and more specifically, who's controlling it or manipulating it. So today I'm talking with Michael Woudenberg, the author of The Polymathic Being on Substack, as well as several science fiction books. His work focuses on polymathic thinking, OODA loop, and human-centric explorations across domains and disciplines. In short, he deals in synthesis, and true to that, he's operationally proficient across many different and seemingly unrelated fields, including space systems engineering, program management, and a lot more. So, Michael, thank you so much for coming on the show.
Absolutely. And that's a great prelude into a lot of the issues that we deal with from day to day.
Well, perfect. I want to start off the discussion by asking this right off the bat. How much of your framework assumes good faith inside the system?
Oh, that's a difficult one. Ironically, my default is probably assuming good faith, but very quickly, as I work to ascertain otherwise, um, there's a great quote, Hanlon's razor, never attribute to malice what can be properly associated with incompetence. So when we talk about bad faith, I tend to default to incompetence first. And then when I've exhausted that, I start looking at the bad faith elements.
So, how do you distinguish between honest, incompetent error and deliberate manipulation inside the system?
Well, that's an interesting. Okay. There's a incompetence can actually be the latter. It can be that manipulation.
Mhm.
Oh, I was just reading an article this morning on, the Citibank or not Citibank, Circuit City and Blockbuster and everything else. And the data was being manipulated. Sales figures were being inflated. Decisions were actually incentivized that drove improper behaviors. Now, was it malicious? No, it was incompetence, but it still led to manipulation. Another great example right now I'm dealing with, we're trying to kick off at in my company the idea of mission focused solutioning. So instead of trying to go in with the answer, I don't come at the problem, don't come with a solution looking for a problem. Really work to understand the customer. In this case, it's the Space Force and the Department of War. Understand what their mission space is, help them define their problem spaces, and then work to bring and weave together so many other things. Now, that sounds like that's how we should be problem solving anyway. But when we look at how the Department of War is structured, it's all siloed and compartmentalized, and there's initiative or there's incentives and everything else that pull people in the wrong direction. Now, that's not malice, but that does lead to manipulations and that leads to poor behaviors. The same thing within even the company that I work for, Modern Technology Solutions Incorporated, MTSI. We work on the government side of the table. We're called a SETA, Systems Engineering and Technical Assistance, and we try to help the Department of War and the Space Force kind of uncluster themselves, for lack of a better word on that one. But even our internal elements are structured in a way that leads to that lack of coordination, lack of, going back to the OODA, reorientation and reorientation to try to adapt and adjust. But again, it leads to a degree of manipulation of outcomes and things like that. But again, not maliciously in that sense. Does that make sense?
Absolutely. So, if I'm understanding you right, it goes back to the idea that intent doesn't necessarily matter if the effect is the same.
And what you find on that one is that very correct. The if you're malicious you'll have an outcome. If you're incompetent, you'll have a very similar outcome. And what I find is almost very few people are actually that malicious. But when they are, that's an interesting one. You actually find somebody that's malicious. Holy sweet goodness, that can be hell.
You talk about feedback loops and things like that, input layers, all of these. I love these phrases, but for the average Joe Blow, they can kind of make eyes glaze over and things like that. So let's break it down to
Hmm.
absolute layman level. When you're talking about a feedback loop, what are you referring to?
Oh goodness. I'm trying. My brain's running through some of the articles I've written on this as far as so there isn't one, and it's not a thing. Um, it really is making sure that okay, so let me take a step back. So what I consider how I describe systems thinking and also the polymathic mindset are three things: insatiable curiosity, the humility to accept I don't have all the answers, and intentional reframing, taking that problem, rotating it, and making sure that I can see it from the multiple perspectives. So, at the simplest distillation, if you're doing that, if you have that insatiable curiosity to keep looking out at different things and trying to fuse and see how they relate and everything else, too often we spend so much time saying, oh, that's different. And I always challenge my teams, tell me, have the curiosity to tell me how they're similar before we discount them, right? So that curiosity. The humility basically says, I don't know everything. I'd better start looking for more. And then the third part, that intentional reframing, forces you to say, okay, I think I've tapped this one out. If I rotate that problem. So the best example of this one was from science fiction, actually. It's Ender's Game. And it's the concept of the enemy's gate is down. And in this zero gravity battle lab, the students were fighting as if they were on the ground. So they're fighting across the lab. And Ender said it's zero G's, no gravity. What happens if we view it as if the enemy's gate was down? How would that change the tactics? Well, it just so happens it changes it dramatically, and he was brilliantly successful because of it. So when you talk about the feedback loops, I would say the best way to for anybody on this listening here to understand that is are you insatiably curious to look everywhere? Do you have the humility to accept other inputs, and are you reframing? And if you do that, you're going to find your feedback loops.
You know, I'm thinking of a Rubik's Cube right now, if you remember those. I
Yep,
used to love those. And it's kind of like when you're holding it, you're describing, okay, you can stare at the top of it and wonder why you can't solve it, but you have to be able to rotate it and look around and see how all the different colors relate to each other.
100%. That's a great analogy. That's a great analogy. You cannot solve a Rubik's Cube looking at one side alone. The algorithm actually requires three sides.
That's fascinating. So now that we understand kind of the feedback and the three pillars of polymathic thinking, what at what point, you talk about incentive systems and things like that. When does that loop, if you want to call it that, of feedback stop being informational? So like if you and I are working together and I'm giving you feedback or you're giving me feedback, when does that stop being informational and start moving into more of a political or a relational function?
I would say it always was that.
Talk to me about that.
Um, I mean, if specifically around, I mean, even within an AI, I recently wrote an article about how AI or your reaction to AI is a reflection of you. And so it was kind of interesting. There's this little, it was a fun prompt about asking AI how it would describe your interactions with it. And, are you collaborative? Are you actually polite to AI, right? Because even in that sense, it's a, in theory, an inanimate object, but it's still relational, and it's a reflection of your relation. And I think that's important because everything, especially even with, we talk about trust with autonomous systems. That's a really interesting one because you would think, do I trust my self-driving car? It's actually improper framing in an interesting way, is because it is actually relational between how you look at it, but it's not like trust is so relational. And it's not that I actually trust my self-driving car, but I will entrust it to perform specific functions under specific conditions and specific roads, let's say. I don't have blanket trust, but I also don't have blanket trust for anybody. Like, do I trust my kids? Absolutely. Do I trust them with knives? Yeah, well, with training. Do I trust them juggling knives? Absolutely not. So do I not trust my kids? Well, no, I don't trust my kids under that specific circumstance and that specific thing. But so this is where okay. So let me back up. So I wanted to do that for the inanimate objects of human or relational and or political sort of activities because they exist there as well. Pulling it back, any sort of feedback loop is political and or relational. So maybe I'll just pause there and see if you have any how we want to reorient that conversation.
I'm actually suddenly very interested in the fact that I have never realized until just now that I say please and thank you when I do use AI.
Oh
And
yeah, I
I'm
do that
wondering
when
what
so
that
in case
says about me now.
no, in case there's a great comic on that. Why do you say please to I think it was like an Alexa or something. Well, that's because when they take over the world, I just in case they take over the world, like oh not
I
don't kill that one. Yeah, he said please. She said
I
please.
want the lion to eat me last.
Yeah, right. Good kitty, good kitty.
Exactly. You wrote a recent article about psyops, and you said
Yep.
psyop until proven otherwise.
Yep.
What specifically are you trying to train people to detect? Is it a false information, or are we going back to that manipulated perception?
It's that one's one of my favorites. I share that one all the time. And it's the way I describe it in the article, just the tagline, right? Intentional incredulity, right? So this is an interesting one because talk about the OODA, right? Oftentimes the OODA is just action biased. But in actuality, the OODA should be a pause in your action bias to make sure that you are oriented correctly.
Hmm.
And so PSYOP until proven otherwise basically says in today's world, if you feel like if you look at something, you're like, oh yes, right? If you just there's certain triggers that I have learned to identify in my body, in my actual physiology, where I start getting wound up about something, and I'm like, ooh, I'm losing my agency. Somebody's got me going somewhere. What is the trigger? And if I can pause for a second, and I may still agree with it, it may not be wrong. It may be, it may be what I believe, but at least I understand why I'm leaning in that way. The bigger issue is you see a lot of people reacting, and when you call them out and you're like, what on earth? And then you start to see that they were never, this was never a rational thought process about what they're doing. It was an emotional hijacking. And then you start to wonder who's doing the hijacking. So that's why for me, the intentional incredulity says if it feels really good for me, like the information, I'm gonna pump the brakes hard and try to figure out why it feels so good and whether I'm being manipulated by somebody else.
Well, that would be true if it makes you feel really bad as well,
Oh,
because
100%, 100%.
essentially,
And negativity bias is absolutely what's being fueled. Yeah, they want you, and you see this all the time with all the buzzwords and things like that. Um, so this is so I there's a paragraph here. So for me, I treat everything as a psyop until proven otherwise. This is especially applicable if I really want it to be true. The more I want it to be true or false, the more likely I am to fall victim to a psychological operation. PSYOP until proven otherwise is a great way to pause our emotional elephant and let the dust settle on a contentious topic. It forces us to step back so we can apply rational analysis. Now, actually, that's an interesting one because are you familiar with Jonathan Haidt's book, The Happiness Hypothesis? So he postulates that we like to think of ourselves as logical, but we are emotional beings. Our prefrontal cortex or logical prefrontal cortex is actually a very late addition and fundamentally only in the last like several 100,000 years. It's also the last thing to mature into our mid to late 20s as we grow up. So he postulated that we are an emotional elephant with a rational rider. And too often, what we see in social media is pink elephants on parade. People get their emotional elephants goaded and they start rampaging, stampeding through the jungle, and the rational rider is barely able to hold on. But we are incredibly good at rationalizing. I think it was Robert Heinlein said, "We are not a rational man is not a rational animal. It is a rationalizing animal." So when you think about it, there's another book called Descartes' Error by Anthony Damasio. Anton Damasio. Anyway, he wrote about people with brain injuries where they basically lost their ability to emote, and it did not make them, the pure logic did not make them smarter or better. It actually made them functionally incapable because there's too much information. We need to prioritize it. We need those emotional jumps. But the problem is, though, if we don't understand the elephant in the rider, and we don't understand how to begin to manage and or ride the elephant or know what triggers that elephant, we are always going to be victim to that manipulation. So going back to those, you were talking about manipulation and negative or what was the term you used? The people who are trying to be problematic. They will absolutely get your elephant going. And that's what you need to be aware of in that sense.
That pretty much describes all of X, I think.
Oh, 100%. Oh, X and Blue Sky are great examples of both.
Oh my goodness sakes. And I tell people a lot. So there's so much that I want to pull out of everything that you just said, but I'll start with this. I tell people if something makes you feel good or makes you feel bad, the first question you should ask is why? What is it within me that makes this want to be true? And essentially, what you're describing is kind of this weaponized critical thinking, right? Where why does this make me feel good? Why do I want it to be true? What would make me not believe it? And I think that's a sticking point for a lot of people because they want it to be true so bad that there's nothing you can tell them that would make them disavow this belief that they have now found.
Okay, so what you just brought up was so I have an article called Default to Truth. And so Gladwell wrote a book called Talking to Strangers. And he basically had said that we have a bias towards trusting that the things are told are truthful. And but he but the problem is it's not that we have a default to trust that to believe it's true. We have a default. So he uses let me kind of summarize this a little bit. He uses examples from Neville Chamberlain believing Hitler to double agents in the CIA to how we can feel we trust people. But really, Neville Chamberlain really wanted to believe that Hitler wouldn't start a second world war. So he believed Hitler, notwithstanding what Hitler said in Mein Kampf. We ignored what Hitler actually said he was going to go do because we really didn't want another war. The CIA also really wanted to believe that they were a premier spy agency and didn't have a ton of double agents. So they actually ignored the evidence that they had dozens of double agents. The Penn State leadership really wanted to believe that Jerry Sandusky wasn't a pedophile. And so they overlooked and they ignored a ton of behavior. Investors really wanted to believe that Bernie Madoff had never really dug and never really dug into his investment returns. They were like they wanted it to be true. And so we act as if it were, not because we have a bias to truth. We don't default to truth. We default to what we want to be true. And that's a confirmation bias.
This kind of ties into something else that I've seen very often as a trauma counselor, where people, if you ask them, do you have value, for instance? And they'll say, well, of course, humans have intrinsic value. And it's an intellectual fact that they understand and say that they believe. But emotionally, where they make their decisions from, they act as though they do not believe it. And that gap is really prevalent in a lot of people where they'll tell you, well, of course you shouldn't read everything you see on the internet. Also, I believe everything that this person puts out, or I believe everything that's on this X account, or what have you. And so that gap between the intellectual and the emotional is really fascinating for me.
Yeah, you are absolutely hitting on kind of the core. So uh, a grouping of essays that I write. So I have a couple different, call them series. One is called Keys to Innovation, and it's focused on like tech leadership, business leadership, things like that, kind of what we originally entered the conversation with. So things like, functional stupidity and the successfully unsuccessful and lazy leadership are all titles of essays I've written on this one, which are, embracing the divergence, are you asking a fish to climb a tree? Just different ways to look at the business world to unlock innovation. And that kind of goes to the previous part, but that's one form of that psychology. The other side is called mixed mental arts, which is the way I described earlier was grappling with complexity in the octagon of life. And really what it is it's forcing you to face what you just described. We have cognitive dissonance where I liken that to like two, rare earth magnets. And you try to push the same poles together and it resist, and then it just flips so fast and connects as if it were always like that. And you see people doing this. You see that cognitive dissonance where they're holding two competing ideas in their mind, and then it just literally just flips in their brain and it goes click, and it's as if that thing never happened. Your brain is so smooth at that transition. It's amazing. And so this is where it's important, I think, and this is where mixed mental arts, I have an essay titled "You Know Nothing," talking about cognitive dissonance. But what I look for, and this is one of the ones I've learned to do myself, is when I'm facing that cognitive dissonance, I actually know the feeling. It kind of right in my solar plexus, I start to feel this angst, this tension that I'm holding something, and then I want to run off, and I don't like to face what somebody's trying to tell me, and that's where I know I'm about to dissonance myself, and I need to slow down, and that's probably the point I'm going to learn something right there. And so what you just described is interesting because it's impossible to get people to, if they're not willing to slow down, that's where Psy up until proven otherwise is trying to talk about, take that tactical pause. You're not ever going to be able to face that tension, if that makes sense.
No, absolutely. I actually just shot you a link in the chat there. I'd written an article called The Five Types of Loyalty, where we all have loyalty, but are we loyal to people? Are we loyal to an ideology? Are we loyal to outcomes,
Oh, 100%.
identity, or are we loyal to truth? Because I'm arguing that truth, loyalty, is the only thing that actually survives contact with reality.
However, you're never going to, I'm looking forward to digging into this one, right? Um, so it goes back to that, you can't handle the truth. Um,
Well,
so
and you're
this is
never going
this
to
is
get
an interesting
100%
one
there.
because there's capital. Okay. Oh, geez. Um, all right. We're gonna, anti. So here's an interesting twist on this one is, so I've written about, kind of truth regarding the Bible, right? So I
Hmm.
think that's let's not talk about contentious things like identity and family. Let's talk about the Bible, right? But there's this guy I know, and he basically was trying to prove that things in the Bible were historically true. And so he was shoving things into historical context that didn't need to happen. And in trying to force the thing to be capital T truth, missed that is the Bible the capital T truth? Well, if you do that, you start to squeeze it so hard, you actually fracture the intent of the Bible because it contains thousands and thousands of truths. And the harder you squeeze it to be the truth, the more you actually lose the fact of all of the. So that's one of those weird ones where there's actually a delineation in there where that scale that you show in your article almost needs to be balanced that we actually to understand the capital T truth we have to understand the lenses of the people ideology outcomes and identity.
Okay.
Now I haven't read yours to actually
I'm
to discern whether you made that argument or not, but that's an interesting segue in what truth is in a way as well.
See, and my brain kind of short-circuited for a second. So I have that angst right now where it's like, okay, I'm about to learn something because I approach the Bible as a Christian. And so I'm trying to parse out what you're saying because I do see the Bible as objective truth.
It's I would love, so let's pause on that part right now. We can always swing back on that one, but I shared the link on anti-fragility in the Bible that it kind of explains my tech because and so here's something as well is I went on what I called a theological adventure over a decade ago where I came from like evangelical Christianity. My wife was Lutheran. we were going to a Lutheran church, and I study to show yourselves approved. I took that seriously, and I started diving in. But I was taking a capital T truth approach to it, and it
Mhm.
led me into down the path of like Hebrew roots, kind of Messianic Judaism, things of that nature. And then when the capital T fractured on me, there's a group of us, a bunch of people actually kind of just said screw it and threw it all away. My cousin and I actually kind of sat there and tried to keep understanding it. And it's interesting because I find more value in the Bible today than I did back then when I was trying to make it capital T truth.
This is so fascinating because it's not like a normal discussion where everybody just says, "Oh yeah, that's a great point." No, we're actually like pushing back and forth, and I really like that. But I think we're going to have a conversation specifically about this, but this will take up all day. So
Oh
I
yeah, we
want
could.
to set
Yeah.
it aside momentarily, and I want to go back to the elephant.
Yep. Let's.
So you described the elephant, fast, emotional, upstream of reasoning, all of that fun stuff. That means, if I'm understanding you right, you would also agree that emotion is the primary entry point for influence.
Oh, 100%. So your body, your everything, your prefrontal cortex doesn't get the message to rationally apply anything until long after. So the startle reflex is a great example. I come up behind you and I go, boo. Your entire body will physiologically react. It will drop adrenaline. It will constrict cardiovascular. It'll spawn actually sweat reflex because a slippery body is harder to grip than a dry body. So you'll actually break out in a sweat as a reflex. Your heart rate will go up. Your bowels will constrict and move. Your entire body will jerk towards action long before you actually understand and recognize what the hell just happened and realize that Mike's being a jerk and is startling me. And then and so it's interesting because the everything is processed by the elephant before the rider gets a sense of what's going on.
You're almost talking about a form of left of bank.
Mark McGrath and Kyle Shepard and Sam Alamo and
Love them all.
yep, and they're all we're all kind of have come into Kyle Shepard and the whole group. We've kind of come into this interesting orbit on that one, and it's fun to see how we all kind of write about this. Um, so left of bang is yeah. So in that sense, it's making sure this goes back to, again, PSYOP until proven otherwise is pushing you away from the bang. It's getting you left of bang. It's getting you to start to see patterns that are emerging long before the effect. Um, and so that intentional incredulity or that those tactical pauses, right? The intentional non-action is a way to extend your left of bang from that reaction, I would say. If that's where you
No,
were thinking about it.
absolutely. Well, and I was thinking of the biometric cues that you're describing because that is one of the six domains in left of bank.
Yeah,
And
yeah.
so that also brings me to thinking about, okay, if I understand these domains, I can engineer emotional triggers to cause them.
Oh yeah,
Be
absolutely. Yes. Oh, yes.
and if I'm an actor who's intentionally shaping somebody's emotional response because I want to push them either, toward bang as a general idea or just toward less good, I guess, cognitive
Yeah. Yeah.
processing,
Oh yeah.
then if I'm managing your emotions,
Yes.
I control you.
100%. Um, so
I
that's
control your downstream action as well.
so I have written extensively on that. Like there's one that was more recent on narcissism and NPCs. And how with the blending of those together is a catastrophe. And fundamentally, what we're talking about here, which you just described, is an outcome. The solution is simply agency. Now, that's not simple at all. There is so much going on there. Because agency requires you to understand so much, and that's what the mixed mental arts is about. So if I was going to describe mixed mental arts in application, it is about you and how you control you, and then how you interact with the environment around you. If you think you're going to do mixed martial arts and you're going to be affecting others, you're already wrong. Like you have to do the work yourself. So when I write about this, I am working to apply these things to myself first. Now, I'm not writing these to tell Kit how to go, how to live your life. I'm writing these to try to articulate how I can better run my life. And that's agency. That right there. And if we can own ourselves, then we're not manipulatable like you were describing.
But humans rationalize decisions all
Oh,
day,
100%.
every
Yep.
day.
Yep.
So how can somebody distinguish a genuine reorientation or, calibration with that reality, that ongoing process from just, I'm getting really good at self-justification?
Hmm. Really good question. I'm trying to think. Sorry, I'm trying to think of the simplified answer. I'm going back to your challenge on the layman's terms, right?
We'll just go with
So,
the default one. We'll explain it later.
well, I would say it goes back to okay, goes back to the three pillars. Curiosity, but then so if the overconfidence is humility. You've got to have that humility to say, I'm really good at rational, I am just awesome because you're rationalizing. Or if you have doubt, right? That intentional doubt, like that's the intentional incredulity on what you're reading. I mean, if we recognize that we are not rational, that we are rationalizing, and you don't want to keep okay, so there's an interesting twist here because there's a lot of people out there who are absolutely comfortable with where they're at. And you
Mhm.
look at them and you're like, you have no agency. You are all over the place, but they are so self-rationalized that they are just somebody else's weapon. You're not going to be able to fix that. I mean, I would hope they'd read some of these essays and understand a little bit about that. But for the person who's already willing to ask the question that you have, there are a ton of different tools because you're already being willing to question whether you are right or whether you are rationalizing. And I'd say that's the first major step. That's that curiosity and that's that humility at the basis.
How does somebody know that they, as the rider on the elephant, is actually steering and not just narrating, I guess, what the elephant already decided?
That's a
Like,
great point.
hey,
I
we're
would say the initial thing is you actually aren't controlling that elephant that much. You have very limited control, cognitive control over your body, right? So you can do things logically to reframe. We're talking about the different cognitive tools that you can apply. Um, but your body is operating in a stasis, or not a stasis. It's operating. It's operating without you. It's basically an autonomous system. So that's the elephant. Like about you think about what you can do physically to calm emotions. You deal with this in your counseling, I'm sure. Fundamentally, it comes down to breathing.
right.
Breathing. That's it. That's the only thing that we can actually have a control over to reset our vagus nerve and start to reset and be able to bring the body back into alignment. Um, and so that's interesting. If you accept that that's all the control you really have to really as far as the physical body, then mentally, then you have these tools to kind of go through these processes. If you can accept that, then you're always going to be going back to the rationalization. You've opened the door to get into the rest of these understandings of how the brain works.
I noticed too that the environment is designed to keep the elephant constantly rampaging.
100%.
So,
100%. They do not want your elephant. If they're okay, so here's the thing. If you think you're in control of the elephant, and I know you don't, and I want to control your elephant, I can control your elephant much better than you if you don't know how to control your elephant, right? It's like having a toddler on an elephant ride and, somebody else is guiding it around, right? That kid is never going to turn that elephant. And so anybody who knows how to control your elephant better than you are their puppet.
well, if you think about it, a lot of people don't understand that they're riding an elephant. They just think they run really fast.
Well, so what you're hitting at is kind of the core thesis of what what my mixed mental arts kind of clusters of essays are getting at is to help people understand. Like and I've shared in the chat, and if you want to put these in the show notes, like elephant riding is an essay. It kind of introduces the concept. Just recently, just now, I posted one on brain glitch, which talks about cognitive dissonance and how what we're talking about, that cognitive smoothing and being able to recognize when we are glitching. And all of these mixed mental arts, these are all tools that can be applied. They're so these are, each one is a mental art, and we're learning how to mix them. And by learning how to mix them, there's not one move that's going to make you a perfect human and insusceptible and everything else. I still find myself being triggered. I still find myself glitching. I still find myself my elephant stampeding. But I've learned enough mental arts to realize to how to understand that. And then expanding that beyond just me and my elephant and recognizing that other people are trying to manipulate my elephant and to begin to gain agency over myself and within myself in the environment that I'm executing, where everybody is trying to one way or the other, there's manipulation. So now we're kind of back to the beginning, like, malicious intent. And it's interesting because we are, no matter what, we are in an environment, and that environment is manipulating. I don't mean manipulating in the negative sense of that right yet, but it is manipulating us, right? It is changing who we are and adapting us and everything else. The more agency we can apply into that manipulation, the less the negative and or just incompetent malicious and or just incompetent manipulation will actually force an effect on us.
So that kind of actually answered my next question, which was, can individual awareness hold if the system is rewarding reactivity and punishing restraint? And I have this visual in my head of us being pulled and we just dig our heels in and furrow the dirt, so to speak, and slow that process and force them, force it to slow down.
I would go back to the martial arts concept, right? I don't need to grow. I just need to pivot, roll, dive, flip, like judo or different different manipulations where you're using your opponent's strength. You don't have to go hard. Mixed mental arts isn't about just a a a, a hard wall. Stop. Urgh. You see a lot of that on social media. The harder you dig your heels in that sense, the more rigid you become and the more fragile you become, and that's its own issue, right? We're looking to train anti-fragility of the mind, and that means being able to pivot, roll, flip, identify, and kind of read and continue to maneuver through the environment.
So now you're talking about learning, unlearning, all of that good stuff.
Did you read that essay too?
I did.
There we go. Yeah, learn, unlearn, relearn, and it goes back, and that's a very much in the it's the reorientation. Reorientation. This is something Mark McGrath talks about in UDA. UDA is not a linear process. UDA is a cycle, and if you are not constantly reorienting and continuing to go through, I actually personally have had a bias against UDA for a long time, mostly because everybody gets it wrong. I'm just willing to kind of throw it out and be like, okay, fine, let's go somewhere, let's use something else because I'm tired of correcting people. Mark McGrath fights the good fight on that one with his the world reorientation in describing it. But it's that learning, then learning to unlearn so that we can relearn. And that's just reorientation over and over again as we continue to evolve and adapt.
But what prevents somebody from unlearning something that is socially costly?
I mean, I think it was almost self-definitional. When it's socially costing, the incentive structure makes it hard, and that's why it's rare. Um,
But that goes back to validation. It goes back to kind of this validation shame continuum that I talk about.
100%. And truth versus organization versus everything, right? There's a certain point in time that humans are social creatures. You can't be you are never going to be able to be completely separated, and you shouldn't be because that's antisocial, and that, in my opinion, is anti-human. So there is always a tension there of what you might call it social acceptability. However, whether there, yeah, that's an interesting one. Um, God, how would I just? The problem is there's a personality proclivity, the agreeable versus disagreeable, and I tend to be a little bit more disagreeable, so it's easier for me to put my foot down and say, "Hey, no, that's a line I'm not going to cross." But but to people who are very agreeable, the cost structure is completely different.
Now you're getting into personality types, that whole debate you had with Karina.
Yep, absolutely. And that was a fun one as well. It's interesting because actually Mark McGrath and Karina both have a very negative view on the personality types. I find them that was a really funny one because I actually kind of caught it was a great example on because I was on a podcast with Mark. I find them to be insanely useful. So let me go back to the work environment. So I'm an ENTJ. And what's important about that, and people complain about Myers-Briggs all the time. Again, it's useful. And you know what? It sticks to landing 95% of the time. So what's interesting is that NTJ is a very interesting or a unique group because only 25% of the population are actually intuitive thinkers. And so those are the ones who are looking. That's why the polymathic mindset. That's why it comes just much more naturally. Now, in the STEM fields, it's even less. It's probably more like 15% are intuitive thinkers. And in my world, it's interesting because I'm trying to weave together these complex things. And with the thinking and judging, I have the analytical, and then the judging is kind of that conscientiousness, the orderly versus disorderly. So it's a little bit more orderly. So intuitive, broad, with high trait openness, very low neuroticism on bringing in the oceans, with a thinking and judging or a conscientiousness and an analytical brain, that makes it a very unique capability that we can have a lot of these very diverse conversations. But I have to recognize that there are a lot of people who don't have those proclivities, and I run into them all the time. Like just this morning, just before this conversation, I was on a call and I'm trying to weave together about five different concepts. And they're like, well, we talked about mission focused solutioning. So one of my coworkers was like, so what's the thing we're delivering? Is there a checklist that we go through? And I'm like, okay, you are absolutely a sensor. And no, if you think it's a checklist, then you've already lost the idea of what mission focused solutioning is. The same way, if you think OODA is linear, you've lost the idea that it's not. You've lost your sensor versus the intuitive OODA executor.
I personally really like Myers-Briggs. I don't think it's, objective truth, but I know that for me, being an INTJ, you might as well slap my photo next to the description of that type.
Oh yeah.
And I know that it's very interesting in my family because my husband is an INFJ, but my son is an ENTJ. And
Hmm.
so we have some really fascinating conversations with different, I laugh that my son's extroversion is just it's baffling to me. But sometimes my husband's F facet is baffling
Yeah.
to me. But it
Yeah.
it offers a really nice contrast in good discussion.
If you can manage it. And this is where one of the things, like one of the bigger issues with not understanding or not liking personality proclivities is like, and this is what it blows my mind when people are viscerally against them because I'm like, you talked about are absolute truth. It's like, no, but they're highly useful because, I disagreed with Karina on this one because it's like, no, we are not so unique as to be, indistinguishable. And yes, there are differences in personality. I mean, you can see that. Like, you can see somebody who is more neurotic versus me. Like they're just I deal with this all the time at work. Like, oh, you've got to be careful. You got to go talk to this person. You got to go. I'm like, dude, just go do the thing and get it done. Like, stop worrying about everybody else. But if they're high on that one and they're agreeable, they're going back to that comment you made about being able to break away, being the divergent thinker, or disagreeing with the way and getting out of a manipulative environment. If you're neurotic and agreeable, that's going to be a lot harder and even more likely. I won't have ever been put into the position because I'm disagreeable and not neurotic. I'm gonna be like, no, that looks silly to begin with. versus somebody else who will just walk right into that. So that's what's also interesting is, and another aspect of leadership, if you're an ISFP, like the exact opposite of me, you are not going to be able to lead like I lead, and not nor should you. The problem is we have a certain model of what we think good leadership is, and we say anybody can be that sort of a leader. Well, not if you're an INFP. An INFP will never be the stereotypical leader that we think about in business. They're just not coded for that. It's not going to work. There will be so much discordance and everything else. So, one of the values of the personality proclivities is actually understanding who you are so you don't force yourself into situations where you're either at odds with the expectations and or vulnerable to the manipulation.
But how does the concept of discomfort in the pursuit of growth factor into that? Because
You
I
can
hear what you're saying, and I also am asking that side.
Oh, that's a great. That kind of goes back to that other question. Um, okay, so you can do hard things. So I have three kids, and the my two older girls are into. Well, we're all into mountain biking, but the older girls are old enough to compete, and so we've been working through uh, different training and everything else, and it's like they want to go faster. Okay, you actually have to pedal harder. You have to be uncomfortable. And the same thing when we do our weightlifting workouts. I tell them that the pain you are feeling right now, that discomfort is a feature, not a bug, because we are actually anti-fragile. You cannot build muscle, you cannot build mental resilience without stressors. So we actually have to tear muscle fibers to grow muscles. You will be sore for several days afterwards. You are actually damaging muscle fibers to be able to build muscle. But with that muscle built, you can now do harder things and build more muscle. Same thing with the mental stuff. I wrote an essay, Trauma and Anti-Fragility, and I would be curious on your thoughts on that one because so many people right now treat trauma as if it's going to break them. Like, and it's the classic thing, oh, I have trauma. And you're like, oh my God, no, you had a growing up experience that you are turning into, you're allowing it to be a wound versus turning it into stronger muscle tissue. But mentally, you have to be uncomfortable to grow, whether it's your muscles or your brain, in my opinion.
I tell people all the time when they first come to me for counseling, this is going to get worse before it gets better. But it absolutely has to be done because kind of an analogy I use a lot is if anybody's at, if you have a McDonald's cup, with a Coke in it or whatever, and you leave it in in your vehicle console, it's eventually gonna break down and start leaking everywhere. And a lot of times, rather than heal the wound, people will just as it starts leaking and creating the sticky mess all over their car, they wipe all the way around the cup and they just keep wiping it up and keep wiping it up. It's like, no, just deal with the cup.
Hmm. I mean, and you went back to the same problem actually exists in business. One of my first articles was the great cover-up, a Band-Aid paradigm, which we treat problems in the workplace the same way. Like and I liken it like, similar thing. Like you get a cut on your arm. It's like, well, we'll, slap a Band-Aid on it. We'll fix it when you get this product out the door. Then the Band-Aid starts oozing. So they slap another Band-Aid on it. But soon, but if you don't address it, if you didn't address it correctly the first time, the consequence of taking a gangrenous wound and cleaning it and actually removing flesh and restitching it and the physical therapy and everything else that is required later after you have the massive mess. If you thought that your initial trauma was bad, like you said, your cascading trauma is even worse, and you're going to have to start peeling back layers that are going to be significantly more painful than the underlying trauma. Especially, and goes back to one of the points you made earlier, if you make it part of your identity, and there are too many people making minor trauma part of their identity and relishing. And also a great example, so I'm a veteran. Great example is PTSD. I am so pissed that the VA made PTSD a permanent and totally disabling diagnosis. PTSD should not be. Yes, veterans have PTSD. Yes, I have elements of PTSD. Yes, I could say the magic word and get 100% VA disability at $4,400 a month. That's a shit ton of money for saying the magic words and making it part of my identity. But when you make it part of your identity in that sense, what happens in the VA is people attend PTSD training until they hit 100% and then they never show back up. They have no incentive. They actually have disincentive. They don't want to lose the monetary compensation by actually fixing their PTSD. And so I have seen people turn, one fellow in particular, claim to, so got into the army, went through boot camp, had during one of the live fire exercises there, somebody had a negligent discharge nearby him. Was no one was ever at threat anything. The gun just went off into the dirt, 30 feet ahead. Then went over to Korea, tweaked his knee, got medically discharged, but then has been fighting with the VA and just got 100% disability for PTSD for that negligent discharge that was at no threat. But because he was pushing so hard to get there and to make the case, he internalized PTSD and now legit has triggered his own body into complex PTSD symptoms, and he has no incentive to actually pull those layers back off. He needs it to maintain his compensation.
So he manufactured a psychosomatic disorder and now needs to maintain it.
Yes, 100%. He has created the very thing that we think needs to be cured, right? This is one of the ones that it gets really messy within the military because people are like, "Oh, PTSD." I'm like, "Let me tell you the number of people who actually invented it." Right? They're getting it because there's a monetary incentive. And there is no incentive. So these, the veteran 22 and, fix PTSD. I'm like, going back to your incentives at the beginning, this is pure incompetence. There's no malice here. The incentives are set up wrong. And yet you will never cure PTSD in the Army because the incentives are all in the wrong way.
What should they be?
Well, we're resilient. Going back, we'll call out Kyle Shepard and the resilient mental state. We are resilient. There are things there. I'm not trying to disavow, there is
Right.
trauma. There are things like you can cut off my leg. That is trauma that no amount of positive thinking will get me through. But we are resilient. We can work our way around that. Even just understanding what's in a brain, the fact that our PTSD is funnily a neurological hijacking of normal things. And this goes back to an understanding of the brain doesn't actually remember things like a movie. So this is actually kind of fun. A lot of these concepts that we're talking about, I wove into my science fiction. So my first book, Paradox, is exploring basically it's in the battle over AI, will we lose our humanity or learn what makes us human? And so it's using AI as a literary foil to analyze who we are as humans because the protagonists are trying to upload human consciousness into AI, and that forces us to understand how our consciousness and our bodies work. So it's actually kind of funny. Elephant riding is the title of chapter 20, which is the kind of the crucible element of that book. But a lot of these topics are woven in there. So the reason I bring this up is what's in a brain. How do you capture that? Our brain doesn't process data like a movie, doesn't save a movie. We learn red, ball, round, smooth. We learn, black, plastic, green, tote, and then, garbage bag, things like that, right? So you have all these patterns that begin to work together. What happens with PTSD in a large way is that we've hijacked something. So for a military sense, trash bag associated with IED versus trash bag associated with garbage can, right? We've hijacked it. Now, if you can kind of rewire those connections and break that hijacking superhighway, you can reconnect the right pattern so you can kind of split, ergo that trauma a little bit into the proper contextualization. And again, not talking about like we're not talking about like, oh, just walk it off that you can walk off a amputated leg, but more understanding what this means and how you can work through that a little bit better.
I have realized that I could literally talk to you all day, but in an effort to kind of close this out a little bit, if somebody comes to you and says, I want to get better at riding the elephant, what would you tell them? What does that look like in practice?
I would say go to the the mixed mental arts series, and we can share that link here as well because it's not a single step. The first thing is recognizing you're a rider on an elephant. And then I'll go back to what we entered with. It's the insatiable curiosity to continue to explore who you are, the personality proclivities. Who are you? How does that work? What does work? What doesn't work? Play with it, explore it. Analyze whether it's aligned with where you want to go or what you're doing. Figure out that you're not going to be me as an introvert, and that's fine. How do you and I do me? But we have that NTJ, so we could, like you said, talk for days on these different topics. Secondly, it's that humility. If you have the humility to recognize you don't know everything, you're going to start to explore and get those back to the first part of the conversation, the feedback loops, right? Making sure you have the right feedback loops, and then that intentional reframing, making sure you're rotating that problem. And that's if that would be the simplest distillation I could suggest for anybody wanting to learn more about their elephant.
This is also awesome. Thank you so much for coming on.
No, absolutely. And if you did like the topics, like I said, Paradox is literally the novelization of mixed mental arts. Each chapter goes through and kind of explores different things and all weaves together. Um, and it's really kind of a fun adventure. A lot of great reviews from that one as well. But it is if a lot of this for the listeners is almost too technical, if you want, like you can come to Polymathic Being and you can read all of the science, or you can grab Paradox from the Singularity Chronicles and read where science fiction meets science facts. So two different approaches you can
Fantastic.
hit.
I will definitely put all this in the show notes.
Awesome. Well, I appreciate it. Thank you.
This conversation was probably one of the most challenging ones I've ever had. And even going back through it in the production phase surfaced so many more questions that I could have asked, so many more things we could have gone into. There's an unresolved tension here too, and I'm not sure we're supposed to even resolve it. On one hand, Michael's right. If you don't understand your own thinking, biases, emotional triggers, you're just reacting, right? You're downstream of your own elephant, and that makes you easy to move. But here's the part I'm not willing to let go of. Even if you get really, really good at thinking, if you master curiosity and humility and reframing, that still doesn't mean you're operating in a clean environment, because the environment isn't neutral. And we said it out loud in this conversation. If someone else can shape your emotional state, they can shape your decisions. That's a control problem. So now you have two realities that you have to hold in tension. You need internal discipline and awareness. You need that ability to slow down and question yourself, not to get hijacked by your own reactions. But you also need to recognize that the system, its incentives, and the actors within it benefit from you never doing any of this. And if you ignore that second piece, you can become very skilled and yet still completely misoriented. That's the risk. So the takeaway from me is this. Understand your elephant, certainly, but don't forget to look up and ask who's trying to control the direction you're going and how fast you're traveling. Because both of those facets play a role in where you end up. Thanks for listening. This has been Change the Game.